Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for another That's Wild Tales from the Human Side of Nature. I'm your host, Mike Skargalind. We're so glad you could join us as we sit around the That's Wild virtual campfire. That's Wild, as I'm sure you know by now, is a storytelling event series where all sorts of people tell stories about their experiences in and with nature and the influence and impact that it's had on them. Every story that's told on That's Wild is different, but they're all authentic and they're told by those who actually lived them. We're very excited tonight to welcome a special storyteller, but before we do, a little bit of housekeeping as usual. If you would like to ask our tale teller a question, just look out for the Q&A box, Q&A button, at the bottom of your Zoom window. Click that, type your question in, send it off, and your question will be collected during the story and may be selected for the Q&A session. As usual, the event is being recorded for later use on YouTube and also the New Jersey Audubon website. And the Zoom chat function has been disabled. Don't forget, if you would like to submit a story to That's Wild, you can do that now. All you have to do is go to njaudubon.org/that's-wild and pitch us your story. Tell us about it. You never know, you may get picked for a future episode. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our tale teller tonight. He is an American author, poet, and wildlife biologist who earned his PhD in forest management at Clemson University, where he's currently an alumni distinguished professor at the College of Agriculture, Forestry, and Life Sciences. He's also a widely published author and award-nominated poet, writing about his experiences as a birder, hunter, and wild wandering soul. His poetry collection, Sparrow Envy Poems, was published in 2016, and shortly afterwards, he was named Poet Laureate of Edgefield County, South Carolina. And that is, by the way, he's joining us tonight from Seneca, South Carolina. In 2017, he published his award-winning memoir, The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature. 2 years ago, he was awarded the National Audubon Society's Dan W. Lufkin Prize for Environmental Leadership, which honors and recognizes individuals who have dedicated their entire lives to the environment. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a true nature warrior with both words and ideas, Dr. J. Drew Lanham. Dr. Lanham.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to all of you out there, wherever you may be. I suppose in this point in time, we're sort of meeting somewhere up there or out there, perhaps thinking about where the birds are meeting in the airstream. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to join me wherever you might be tonight to talk to you a little bit about my story. And as I like to say, everyone has a bird story, even if it's the leg of chicken they ate last night or the pigeon that pooped on their car. But I think it's important that each of us tell those bird stories, no matter what they are, or our connections to nature, because it's how we develop not only community, but it's how we move our love of wildness beyond us. It's how we preach beyond the choir. And ultimately, in my work as a conservation ornithologist, I think it's how work gets done, not just the science that's absolutely critical in our way of thinking and teaching us about nature and helping us understand it, but ultimately in some way taking those thoughts, blending them with the passions that we all have for nature in our hearts, and then moving that convergence out to action. So I grew up with birds. I grew up wanting to be a bird. I tell folks that one of my earliest mentors was Wile E. Coyote. Not that I wanted Wile E. Coyote to catch the Roadrunner, which I knew from a pretty early age could actually fly, but Wile E. Coyote spent so much time flying that every Saturday, almost every Saturday after I watched his failed attempts, I thought that I had figured out somehow, some way to develop more lift or more thrust that would take me further in my attempts to fly than Wile E. Coyote did. Well, needless to say, gravity beat both of us, and I was never able to fly as the birds that I envied. The next best thing for me was to study birds, was to live vicariously through them. And so I've spent a great deal of my life, probably from about age 6 or 7, watching birds with intention. And when I say intention, I mean watching them with this idea of there being more to see, that there was somehow some corner that never quite get around to understand not just what birds are, but who birds are. And so after the circuitous career track, I finally found my way into the air. And so here I am with you tonight, hopefully sharing a couple of those stories. Now, I'm a scientist, as I write a good bit about birds. And I wanted to share just a little piece of me, sort of this, this evolution, if you will, from pure scientist to sort of professorial poet. And I write a lot about wildness because there's this tension in wildness, right? That so many of us are attracted to understand sort of the uncontrolled, the undefined, the unbordered. The unknown is defined so much what wildness is. But for us, when those wild things live on the wind and can be pushed and pulled across hemispheres by whim of weather or force of will, how can I not find the words to notice birds? And so I don't just see birds, I watch birds, I absorb birds. And I often now do that without worrying how many other birds might be after a given bird or how many birds I might get on my list. On many days, the bird that I watch is the only bird until the next bird comes along. And all along, I'm taking in these places that I'm so fortunate to live around, but also to travel to, the forests and tangles and sea coast. I pay closest attention to a single bird's way of being, maybe ascribing some name to it. Maybe it's a red-winged blackbird or a black phoebe or a black-necked stilt, a black vulture, a black and white warbler. Most of the identification tasks come relatively easy for me now. Sometimes I have to say, I don't know. But in any case, I see myself in each of the birds I watch. I can feel some of the same struggles that the birds do with headwinds that they might face, or obstacles of lack of safety or protection. But I envy all birds' ability to slip the ties that bind and find freedom, those that can fly. And so I don't just study birds, and I don't just write about birds. I write for birds. And I will tell you, pretty recently, I've begun to write to birds. I write in poem, I write prose, I wordcraft in short form, social media, and long essay. I two-finger tap in minuscule mobile phone font and still sometimes scribble in this illegible chicken scratch script that lies scattered all around me in notepads and pieces of journals as draft stories, ragged verse. And I take those words, I take those ideas of a scientist, the rhythm from the heart of a poet. I gather it all and then I weave and wrap until there is some story in which I can nest. Now, a whole lot of this time I spend in my pickup truck, believe it or not, parked on the shoulder of some road. Right now, the road that has my attention and has for the past, 3 years is this Jones Road, where a loggerhead shrike sort of impaled me, as it were, several ago after an incident with a racist as I was watching white-crowned sparrows. And since that time, I've sat on this road shoulder away from any formal room or space. And there I hone my writing craft. There is no desk there other than the dashboard and steering wheel. Again, my phone is both typewriter and word processor. It's not just my laptop, it's my palm top. My binoculars and camera are in the passenger seat so I can spy, be inspired, and confirm. The notes often start with some word that comes to mind. For loggerhead shrike, it's frequently stuck. Or maybe it's the way the pasture grass waves that day, or how the clouds cast herds of giant shadows on newly plowed ground. Maybe it's how another unarmed Black person died because someone was afraid of them, or maybe it's how dozens have been gunned down in some massacre. And here I am in the midst of birds with the world yet happening beyond me. And so I sit, I watch and think about the beings I know most intimately by song and plumage and habit. But I also think about the world as it exists. And I often write with no intent of anyone else ever seeing, but as an exercise in this sort of solo worship and mind space sacrifice. A murmuration of starlings becomes a sudden meditation. A killdeer call is alms. And in that, there is this melding of realities that causes me to lose track of responsibility and time, and yes, even for a small bit, reality. It's a selfish act in small personal space that I hardly ever share with other human beings. That might be wrong-hearted, but it is who, especially in this quarantine time, I have become an introverted ornithologist, codependent on this ornithotherapy that the birds give without cost. But I gladly pay. Knowledge is power, and the more I understand interactions between earth and sky, birds and us, the better armed I become to defend the soil and water air which we all depend. I pay with attention and time. I pay by becoming more familiar with birds than a cataloging of numbers or lists will ever. Yes, I know birds by their chips and the churs and self-harmonizing sonata of wood thrush. I know birds by the flash of red and gold applet. I know birds by their miraculous span across watery gulfs and landscape desolate by what some would call progress. I know them by the way they launch themselves into the air on a faith absent worshiping any gods except lift and thrust. I know them by home. I know them by my native South Carolina Piedmont that's fragmented into jigsaw pieces. I know them by the nearby Blue Ridge that's hanging on to what's left of wildness. I know them by my South Carolina low country and salt marsh pluff mud. I know them by the faraway places. I know them by Cape May. I know them by the tundra swan winging through moonlight from the low country Ace Basin of South Carolina through your mid-Atlantic, going back to some Arctic realm. I know them by the handful of less than an ounce of feathers, surviving predator and destructive perversion to perch itself in my fortunate view in my tiny backyard to grace my puny, ground-bound, tethered existence. Same boy who watched at 6 or 7 wanting to be a bird, I now get to live my dream. And that's who I am. That's what I do. And I try to take the science that I have learned, that others have learned. I try to take that science and meld it with the data that I know best. Now, the data that I know best most days happens to be me. Now, some days the R square isn't a 1 for me. So there are days that I know myself better than others, but birds always seem to help me know me in a more authentic way. Again, as I said, seeing a single bird, to see the first rose-breasted grosbeak show up in the yard this morning, and just a day before that, not to have an experience with a single bird close up, but with tens of thousands of birds far away. Both of those situations are pretty intimate to me, because I'm not just watching the birds, I'm absorbing these birds in this way, as I'm sure many of you are. We develop relationship, whether we admit it or not. We're taught as scientists not to anthropomorphize, so to not heap human emotions and attributes onto non-human beings. And I agree totally, because I certainly think there are creatures that are far beyond human capacity. We sort of weigh them down with who we are. And so I like to think of birds as being far beyond certainly biological capacity that I have. And that tonight, as many of us are fast asleep dreaming, there are those sojourners that are weaving paths over our heads to faraway places. So again, it's not to be inspired. It's impossible for me not to be inspired by birds, even as the world at times seems to be falling apart around us. Even as we've lost billions of birds, it makes me want to work harder to conserve them, but it also makes me want to work harder to bring others into the fold, not necessarily of having to struggle with the identification of a fall impid, but to know the birds, to see the flight of a pigeon coursing through concrete canyons, and to marvel at that bird's ability to survive, to see the sparrow and envy it because it falls under the purview of your eye. And so that's what birds are to me. They're worshipful beings. They are worthy of our admiration, of our adoration, and us doing more than just scripting their names. So I'm going to share a piece that I wrote just yesterday. And I hope it will give you, again, a sense of sort of the immediacy that I tend to have when it comes to birds. I had spent all day on this place called a Devoe Bank with some absolutely wonderful folks from Cornell, Andy Johnson, but also with Felicia Sanders, who's been an absolute hero here in South Carolina, and I would argue for the nation in what she has done for shorebirds in South Carolina and the Southeast. To witness abundance in present tense, jaw dropped, gasping, awestruck by the ceaseless coming, one or two at first, then flock upon flock, blots of brown thrown into blue sky, tossed northward by warm spring winds, stretched into undulating lines, pulled to corners of the globe by tides urging the skeins of scythe-billed beings, passing by on every side. Arctic bound, but Pluff mud and Atlantic sand satisfied for now. The dozen or so seen together, standing stripe-headed, thick-legged in salt marsh plucking tiny fiddler crabs. You thought in that moment the scene extraordinary. Could not stop watching the 12 because you could not imagine more, could not believe that good could be better, could not believe that less might become more. As if your eyes beheld all there ever were, then your scant thinking is raised joyfully to a power beyond dreaming and sums up as incalculable, feather blessing, multiplied past tens or hundreds or even thousands, or expectation of limitation. So many birds. But then your heart stops in mid-beat musing. In the pause between endless passage, your wild-winged dreams suspend by reality. You breathe, exhaling to remember in past tense of the current miracle witnessed, what it was like when the skies grew dark under the wings of birds with wistful names, knots, plovers, pipers, peeps, too many to count, like passenger pigeons or Carolina parakeets or Eskimo curlews. Someone once thought the number they saw uncountable in their own present tense without future conditional conjugated. Cardiac arrest restarted as another skein passes. You shake your head. And I said, I will do better, Wimbrel. I promise. And so that was just a day or two ago to have this opportunity to be in a place and to see tens of thousands of a bird I had only seen a dozen or two of before, and to witness a global spectacle just hours from my home. That is the way that I try to communicate that to the world. That is a poem that maybe only you will ever hear. I'm not sure whether I'll try to get it published or not, but it is how I think now. That I think about these birds as I watched a flock of several thousand silhouette against a rising rose moon. And thinking about those birds as hemispheric beings. The thousands became one because in those thousands of birds wheeling, I felt the beauty and joy of witnessing it. And so I want to share this with you from my newest book, Sparrow Envy, and just a couple of pieces here, a couple of short pieces. I don't want to try your patience for very much longer. But this book I write, it's called Sparrow Envy, Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts, because we're all lesser beasts when it comes to comparison with birds, in my opinion. This is a book where much of what I write is like what you just heard, but I move, I think, in in a certain direction here. So I'll share a field mark. The book has field marks in it, and this is field mark 3. And it's called Wood Thrush ID, Made Simple. It's not so much about identifying what birds are as feeling who birds are. Head nods, jaw drops, smiles, tears, and abject adoration are all feel marks for identifying the wood thrush, a brown-backed forest-singing soul seldom seen, but more often heard and felt deeply. As this bird pumped its heart out in auto 3-part harmony, the one inside my own chest stopped beating for a while. So I love thrushes. And I write an awful lot about thrushes. But I also write about other birds. And yes, I write about other beasts, things beyond birds. One of the things that I'd like to share is this piece that I wrote about this incident of coming out on the screen porch and finding a gray tree frog there that had somehow gotten into the screen porch. And we have a kitty cat, Trey, who is a 198% indoor cat. He's indoors all the time. The closest he ever gets outside is on that screen porch. And he was just a kitten at the time. I saw him sort of crouching, and so I recognized him quickly, grabbed this gray tree frog to take it outside to safety. This is called Love Handle, and this was inspired by that incident. This is Mark 6. Handle any life in your hands as if it were your own. Feel the heart beating, small as it may be, and imagine it in your own chest, beating in syncopated time to become shared meter. That pulse, that breathing is your rhythm, your ins and outs, its ins and outs. Look close under whatever warty skin or soft fur or gaudy feathers and see self. Its being, your being. Be in that same skin for what moments it will allow. Then, when the convergence between you is sealed, release that wild soul to free roaming as you would desire of your own. So that's kind of my story, a little fragmented, but this love affair with nature, that is my nature and my nurture, that is born in me, that in part lies in this bitter history of enslaved ancestors who were bound to land, but then to me now in some of realized sweetness of having a choice of being in love with the land. And birds are my conduit. Birds are my communion. Birds are the convergence that I don't feel I can live without. And so I work to conserve them, but I also try to work to bring others to that table. So thank you so much for having me here this evening. I look forward to entertaining your questions. And I hope, as I told Lillian, God, I hope to get back up there soon and do some more birding, bird watching and bird absorbing in that very special place called Cape May. So thank you very much, Mike, for the invitation tonight. And I look forward to what folks have to say.
Well, Dr. Lanham, thank you so much. First of all, I think we're very privileged to have heard that poem that you wrote just 2 days ago. That's wonderful. So as I said to you before we went live, you're breaking news and we're very happy about it. Thank you so much. It was a beautiful poem. can I just ask you, Dr. Lanham, just to check that your phone isn't too close to your computer, because the video is a little choppy tonight, and it might be that.
Make sure.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, all of my internet. Let me see here. Let me make sure that.
It could just be the weather.
Is that any better?
A little bit better. It's a little choppy. I mean, we heard most of it. It was just a couple of dropouts, but
okay.
Let me tell you.
I will try to remain still. Maybe that'll help.
No, it's fine. I mean, certainly the power of the poetry came through, whatever, so it's fine.
Thank you. Good.
So we have some questions from the audience, and actually somebody wrote in, beautiful. You seem to experience quite a bit of joy from observing birds deeply. My question is if this is pure joy or if it's tainted with some sort of sorrow for these miracles of nature, which I thought was an interesting question.
Yes, to both questions. It is absolute joy, and you know, I like to say, as I blend sort of these messages of ecology and social justice, that joy is the justice we give ourselves. And so it's certainly birds are one of the ways that I find joy. And so, you know, this example of these shorebirds, of these whimbrel, and seeing them was absolute joy and amazement at, and this is really my first expedition since quarantine, and being among other people and not really knowing how to respond to people. That was odd, being with other scientists and not really knowing how to interact with them, but feeling at home with these birds. And so as I'm watching this spectacle, I'm thinking of just this amazing discovery that Felicia Sanders has made. But then I am also thinking about what it used to be like. We read stories of birds darkening the sky. Then it becomes plausible, and so the joy is tainted a bit because you realize how much we've lost, right? You read these accounts, and when you see tens of thousands of something, but then take it up an order of magnitude and imagine hundreds of thousands,
yeah, and
then another order of magnitude and imagine millions. And people were talking about birds in the millions just a couple of hundred years ago, right? And so that's bittersweet, and that tells you that things can change quickly. And so the joy that I feel in the moment, that's tempered somewhat by the reality of what we have enacted historically, makes me want to work harder, selfishly, so that I can feel that joy again and see more birds, so that others can see more birds. But also so that others don't have to experience the pain of that loss. So, you know, we talk about this age as the Anthropocene, and I tell people one of the ways that I define the Anthropocene is it's an age of woe, right? And I don't just mean, yeah, the obvious, the age of woe, W-O-E, but it's also the age of woe. Stop. Stop.
Yeah.
Right? Stop.
Yeah.
Look what you're doing. And if that's one of the things that birds do. So seeing a single cerulean warbler, right? Hearing that bird, see, and thinking about that bird's travel from the Andes to here and what it had to overcome. That one bird is worthy of just the jaw drop and every bit of the awe that I was having seeing tens of thousands of whimbrel. So yeah, joy is an oscillation, right? And how to ride the wave of that oscillation.
Right. So thank you. Mary writes from the audience, and she's describing the poem that you just wrote. She says, fantastic poem. I could imagine the scene that you painted. And then she asks, what poets have inspired you?
Wow. Mary Oliver, you know, has had and continues to have so much inspiration for me. Langston Hughes, and I think one of the first poems was Dreams. Emily Dickinson, right? And Hope Being the Thing with Feathers. Gosh, Wendell Berry. Just there are so many that are out there that in essayists and prose writers who write lyrically with rhythm. And so, you know, I don't think that Aldo Leopold ever called himself a poet, but certainly that style of lyricism appeals to me. Walt Whitman, I have a special affection for because of that long form and that declarative form that sort of pushes voice and identity out. Maya Angelou and her voice, and hearing her spoken voice and the strength of her poetry. So those are just a few. I'm Amanda Gorman. You know, we think about her. We think about her poem at the inauguration, and I think what that performance did was sort of put poetry back on the radar for so many people. And interestingly, as I my environmental lit class, one of the things when I ask the students who they're reading, many of them can't pick a book and tell me they're reading this or that, but what they'll do, they'll pull up a YouTube video and they'll show me a performance of a poem. Right. And so spoken word is important, and hearing the voice is important. I love listening to writers read their work. I love hearing the accent come through from a writer. I love hearing Robin Wall Kimmerer read Braiding Sweetgrass. I love hearing Janice Ray reading Ecology of a Cracker Childhood. I love hearing Camille Dungy reading any of her poetry. I love hearing Ross Gay read any of his delights. I love hearing Sean Hill in his baritone read about the South or describing a sturgeon. All of those are important. And so, and there are poets who I've read whose names I can't remember, but I'm a huge Robert Frost fan. Right. So I think that, I'm continually sort of incorporating poets. My friend John Lane, who is a poet here in South Carolina, I'm afraid to speak so many names because I'm just leaving twice as many out that influence me.
Right, well, some wonderful poets there that you mentioned, and you do, of course, mention Amanda Gorman, who reminded me again, as if I shouldn't really have been needed to be reminded of this, but how important performance is in poetry. It's so refreshing to hear something come from the well, right? It's just fantastic, fantastic. I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely, Mike.
So we're talking a lot about poetry, and there are quite a few questions about poetry, but the one I had for you was, can poetry teach your students of ecology or biology or whatever it might be as effectively as a scientific syllabus, do you think?
I try to blend the two. I'll tell you, one of the exercises that I have them do when I'm actually working on a book project now with Paul Riss, who many of you might know. We just sort of come up with some of our ideas, but I have my students craft identify birds by haiku. So they've got 17 syllables, at least in the form that I push. So in 17 syllables, I need to understand some identifying character of this bird by sight, sound, some sort of ecological context, so some habitat clue, for example, and then maybe hopefully some conservation that slipped in there with the ecology. And I have them do that because 17 syllables isn't a lot. And to have those students pare down, so haiku brings them to this efficiency. And really, I like to think of it as sort of a sort of gestalt, as it were, that to be able to think about that bird in 17 syllables makes you think in a different way. And they hate it, let me tell you. There are a lot of people that don't like haiku. I happen to love it. But I'm also thinking about cento as a form. So, literally cutting and pasting words. I give you a sheet out of a magazine, and I have you cut out the words to form a poem. And so, those sort of exercises that are both tactile and hopefully in some way mentally labile get students to think about the science in a different way. I'll tell you, one of the tests that I give PhD students in their final oral exams, they're experts, right? They've been working at this stuff for 4 or 5 more years, couple of 100 pages of a dissertation, God knows how many hours writing code and working with statistics, and all of the hours in the field, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the fears, all of that. They've gotten through this exam. You can see they're just wrought. And the final question that I ask is, I'll say, okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to tweet out your dissertation.
And they faint.
You've got, 280 characters or whatever now. And I'll say, and feel free to use a picture. And it's amazing to me how many would not have a picture of some moment during their research in the field. So to be able to communicate, and I say the same thing with climate change legislation. When the scientists presented that important almost 1,000 pages of information to Congress, it was wonderful to drop that thud, right, of all of those pounds of paper. But ultimately, we've got to be able to communicate as the world communicates, and to break science down in a way that's understandable, that's palatable, that maybe has a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down. That's one of the things that poetry does, right? So in the Winterval poem that I wrote, again, my marvel sort of turns to this musing of what was. So present tense becomes past tense. And conservation to me is us trying to conjugate in future and conditional. And so in that way, if I can get students, one of my mantras is, I can lead your brain to knowledge, but I cannot make it think. So I want to get you somehow into some mode of thinking, not telling you what to think, but just to think. And if you can get people to think, that's most of the battle, right? They can make up their minds, hopefully, pulling from here, pulling from there, hopefully, pulling enough data together to sort of do their analysis and make up their minds. That's a win for me. And if I can get there by a poem, all the better. If it's a tweet, so be it. If it's a poem and a tweet, well then, I'm not killing 2 birds with one stone. I've got 2 birds in the same scope. So in that way, in thinking about what can do or what the arts can do, many of you have heard STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. I always say STEAM. You know, my environmental educator friends say STEAM. It's science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. The
Right.
arts are critical as anything in what we do.
Right. Couldn't agree more. Final question for you, Dr. Lanham. I'm curious as to whether your love of nature stimulated, your academic and writing careers, your poetry career, if you like, at the same time, or did one precede the other? How did it sort of work itself out when you're in your early years?
Well, I think that the artistic inclinations have always been there, but were sort of a dormant seed, right? And certainly because one of the things that happened for me was that people began to prescribe a career path for me. And as a Black kid who was good in science and math, they said, "Oh, you should be one of these three things, or two things, and maybe the third. You should be an engineer, a doctor, or you like animals, you can be a veterinarian. You've got those three things that you can be." And so I sort of had to battle first to get people to understand that ornithology, that ecology was a worthwhile profession. I spent a lot of time doing that, a lot of time and energy, and all the while suffering in a passionless pursuit of a degree that other people wanted me to have. So Mike, I sort of hid that talent, if it was a talent back then, under a bushel, as my grandmother said, because if I had come out of my mouth with the idea of being a poet, I think I would have made people faint. They would have said, "Oh my God, he's doomed for poverty and destruction the rest of his life." So I'll be honest, and as I went through the process of publishing or perishing as an academic and finally got to full professor status, child chair, that freed me up a little bit, right? It freed me up to lift the bushel and free the words that were there all along. So I like to say that I've paved the path professionally, and not that I haven't been passionate about the science, but it's a very different sort of peer review that you go through outside of the scientific profession. So it's very satisfying to be able to take what I have done in the past and bring it forward to my now life and be, and be a scientist, but yet be a poet. And there are more of us out there than might be known. It just so happens that many folks have to hide that sort of thing under a bushel, quite frankly, because the world isn't always so accepting of it.
Right, yeah. Well, in your case, there's certainly a great, prodigious talent under that bushel, and we're very, very glad to have heard just a smattering of it tonight. Thank you so much. This has been truly wonderful, but sadly, we do have to bring this to a close now. It's a lovely poetic evening. On behalf of us all, I want to extend my very great thanks to you, Dr. Drew Lanham, for your storytelling tonight, your poetry tonight, and of course, also for the sterling work that you put into our precious wild spaces and all the things that live there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, and everyone, stay safe.
And good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time on That's Wild, Tales from the Human Side of Nature. In the meantime, stay well and stay wild. Good night. Good night, Drew.
Good night.